as, as what I'll talk today, what I'm talking today is research done by my colleague John Bound at University of Michigan, and is funded by SSA through the MRC. And the thing that I say is my opinion and not theirs. As boom generations begin to retire and fiscal from entitlement programs become more acute, evidence of improving health and increased life expectancy in these cohorts has led many to suggest taking advantage of improved work capacity older adults by increasing age requirements for the Social Security and Medicare programs. Currently, however, more than half of workers start receiving Social Security benefits before they reach their full retirement age, and those who do are in relatively poor health. The average 62-year-old may well have improved over the last few decades, possibly like those proposed by the Simpson-Bowles Commission, that availability of benefits by raising the early retirement age or reduce value by raising the full retirement age will affect both the healthy and the unhealthy alike. The purpose of research is to systematically investigate the extent to which the availability of early Social Security benefits provides a safety net for those in poor health, who are not poor enough health to qualify for disability benefits or who, for whatever reason, didn't apply for them. The important policy implication of this is that if there's a larger pool of people in poor health, that will reduce the desired labor force participation response to an increased eligibility age. And a further implication of finding a large amount of overlap in these distributions is that increased eligibility age for retirement benefits could induce an increased rate of application for DI benefits. Before proceeding with our analysis, I should give a little bit of background on the current options facing older adults with health problems. First, as one has a sufficient work history, and that means essentially working 5 out of the last 10 years, one can apply benefits from the Social Security Disability Insurance Program. To make this risky, however. First, an application process for DI is complicated, involves doctors and lawyers, and the outcome is uncertain. While applicants eventually do receive a disability award, they do not. Second, disability, being defined as inability to engage in substantial gainful activity, means that while you're in the application process, any work essentially disqualifies you from benefits. So you have to give up earnings during the application period. Hopefully, once an individual reaches, and I should say that the application process can take more than a year before an award decision is made. Once an individual reaches early eligibility age, which is now 62, as long as there's sufficient work history, which means 10 years out of the previous 20, they can simply elect to receive early retirement benefits, which has no medical or requirement claiming these benefits, and there's a less severe restriction on earned income. However, is that for a given individual, early retirement benefits are actuarially adjusted based on age, while disability benefits are not. So for this, we use data from the Health and Retirement Study, collected from 1992 to 2006, and we separated response in the survey in 4 categories. Those started receiving their Social Security benefits before they were 62, and for nearly all of these people, that means that they received disability benefits. Those received their benefits received early retirement benefits as soon as they were eligible at age 62. Those who waited after their first age of eligibility, but before their full retirement age, that is between 63 and 65 or 66, and then those who waited till their full retirement age or later to retire and start receiving Social Security benefits. Essentially, the analysis here compares these groups, these 4 groups, based on their health, their income, their assets, all measured at as close as possible to the age to age 62 when they would have made their decision about early retirement benefits or disability or having disability insurance benefits. So we find how early retirees differ from later retirees. When at age 62, men and women who took retirement benefits at the earliest possible date were more likely to report that they had health problems that limited their ability to work, and were more likely to report that previously applied for DI benefits. Similarly, when asked about the presence of specific conditions and limitations common to DI beneficiaries, for example, physical difficulties with lower body function, including basic mobility, presence of diagnosed mental illness, who retired early were more likely to report these problems. In terms of available economic resources, early retirees report less income, and among early retirees report lower amounts of financial wealth. For women, wealth gradient is not present, and in fact, those who work the longest tend to have the lowest average wealth. I'll come back to that point later. To summarize the health characteristics of these, compare them to DI beneficiaries, we index of disability based on a wide variety of chronic conditions, physical limitations, and basic demographic characteristics. And without any more time on the specifics of the method, we use this index to rank retirees and distinguish those who would be most likely to be eligible for benefits from those who would be least likely. The frequency distributions of this index for the DI beneficiaries, who are shown in black, and the non-DI beneficiary early retirees or later retirees, who are shown in red, and I do this separately for men and women. As expected, there's a clear difference in the distributions of these two groups, with a significantly larger fraction of DI beneficiaries having high scores and a low proportion of those who are retired having high scores. However, a fair amount of overlap, as you can see on these graphs. Quantify the amount of overlap. We did the percentage of non-DI beneficiaries with disability index scores higher than specific thresholds defined among DI beneficiaries. Here is to define an appropriate threshold for calling an early retiree a potential DI beneficiary. So look first at the bottom row. Definition: 50% of DI beneficiaries have scores higher than the median. However, between 2 and 6% of men not on DI have scores in this range, and between 8 and 12% of women have such scores. Usually restrictive definition, a small but non-zero fraction of early retirees would be considered DI eligible. Using a more inclusive definition of eligibility, that is, having a score above the 10th percentile, 35 and 52% of men, and between 59 and 63% of women would be considered eligible. On my Goldilocks persona for a moment, one of those criteria feels too strict and the other criteria feels too loose. And so for my candidate for the just right definition, let's use the 25th percentile as a threshold. So looking for non-DI beneficiaries who are in the part of the distribution of DI beneficiaries in terms of their disability score. Here, we would count between 12 and 18% of men and between 25 and 41% of women as DI eligible. Take away from the previous slides is that early retirees are not a uniform group, less healthy than others, and presumably less able to work if retirement benefits are no longer available. If we index to separate the DI eligible from ineligible retirees, we can compare these two groups to actual DI beneficiaries on a variety of specific characteristics as at age 62. First, those likely to be DI eligible with high scores on the index we've created are substantially more likely to classify themselves as limited in their ability to work than those with low scores on the DI index. The history of these two groups, incredibly larger fraction of those with high disability scores but not receiving DI benefits have applied previously for DI and not been accepted. Those measures are sort of endogenous, and that means your response to those questions kind of depends on your whether or not receiving benefits. So we look at some other less problematic measures to see how characteristics of these groups compare. On measures, and what I've put up on the slide here is heart disease and mental illness. What we find is that those who are DI eligible look a lot like DI beneficiaries than they do like their counterpart retirees and later retirees who are scored on the disability index. If we look at income and health, DI eligible early retirees again look much more like DI beneficiaries than they do other retirees. So the bottom policy question, however, is whether those most likely to qualify for DI are also those who choose to retire early, or whether reduced earning capacity and lower levels of financial wealth keep them in the labor force. To answer this, we tabulated the age at first retirement benefit by DI eligibility status as we have imputed it. And is being used as a safety net for the least healthy, we expect that they will choose to collect benefits at the earliest possible age. And for men, this is the case. Nearly 2/3 of what we call DI eligible men choose to receive early retirement benefits at the earliest possible date, while less than half of the low-scoring men do the same. For men, on the other hand, this is not the case. However, a substantial portion of women in these cohorts do not meet the work history requirements to collect benefits on their own, and even those who do, for many of those who do, their benefits are not based on their own work history, but on the work history of their husbands. And so perhaps a cleaner comparison for women can be seen looking at single women, which is what we see in the next slide. And for individuals, both men and women, the patterns are apparent. For men, the comparison becomes even more stark, with near 5% men who score on the disability index choose to retire at the earliest possible date. About half of men with lower scores do so, and for men as a whole shows up here. So about half of women with high disability scores choose to retire at the earliest possible date, and about 1/3 of women with low scores on this index choose to retire early. We continue to work on this analysis, incorporating administrative data as a check on self-reported health and benefits information. We can make some conclusions based on our research to date. First, it seems clear that health and capacity for work among the near elderly may have improved on average. This improvement does not mean that everyone in this age group should be expected to continue working. In fact, a noticeable fraction of those who take early retirement benefits appear to do so because they are not capable of continued employment. As a result, increased retirement age requirements in Social Security could have a most profound effect on the most vulnerable among the elderly. Specifically, for an alternative safety net, those in worst health would shift to DI if they could, imposing application costs on themselves and on the government. Who fail to qualify or still choose not to apply face potentially dramatic income losses. So hopefully it's the stage for Jody to give us some alternatives to this scenario.
All right, Tim, exactly what I was hoping, which is set the stage for what I'm going to be talking about. And as he just mentioned, under current policy, if the retirement age is increased, there may be a situation in which benefits for DI are preserved. So they aren't changed from the current policy and people may claim DI. What I want to talk about today is more of a work support approach, which is consistent with the idea of keeping people in the labor force and also consistent with disability policy, which is really trying to promote work among people who have disabilities. Dave and Tim have both provided background of the current policy debate, but I want to highlight a little bit of work that Dave and I did earlier that talk about the fact that under current policies, workers who are older between the ages of 51 and 64 and experience a new work-limiting health condition experience really large losses in earnings and household income. And in that analysis, what we did was compare people who had new onset to people who were as similar to them but didn't experience onset during these ages. And what we found was that compared to the group that didn't experience onset, those who did had declines in earnings that were about 48%. Their household income declined by 23%. They were able to offset some of this using other sources. So for example, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, Social Security, retirement, and disability. But what we found, even using the sources that were available to offset these earnings declines, they really were able to offset a lot of the earnings declines that they suffered as a result of having onset. Found because of this is that workers who do experience this type of condition are much more likely to experience poverty in the years before they claim retirement. And in particular, we found that poverty rates for the group that experienced onset were about 50 to 100% higher than the group that didn't experience onset. What this suggests, as already highlighted, is that there needs to be policies to promote against this type of hardship after onset while still promoting work. So our really an exploratory analysis. And the motivation for doing this is to stimulate interest in a program that's designed to provide work support, and also that such a program would be practical. But what I need to provide a caveat for is that our analysis did involve a lot of assumptions that I won't have time to go into today. We have a paper coming out where you'll be able to see some of the assumptions underlying this, but really what we were trying to do is show that this is a practical way of identifying a target population, identifying some policies that would promote employment, and really looking at the cost of those policies. So specifically what we want to do is identify a population of older workers, again 51 to 64-year-olds, who experience an earnings loss as a result of a work limitation onset. Not only should they have an earnings loss, they also experience hardship as a result, and I'll talk in a minute about how we define hardship. Our goal then was to specify some policies that are designed to promote against this hardship while promoting work, and we consider three such policies that I'll talk about: a health insurance subsidy, an employment services allowance, and extension of the earned income tax credit that would support these workers and incentivize them to stay in the labor force. What we want to do is simulate the cost of the scenarios using various populations and various policies to cost out how much such a program would cost relative to what exists currently. So like we're using data from the retirement study, and in particular we focus on a cohort of people in that study who were ages 51 to 52 years old in 1992. And for those that don't know, the HRS is a longitudinal study that follows people from as early as age 51 until they die every 2 years. So we were able to take the cohort from 51 to 52, follow every 2 years until they reached age 63 to 64. In this 2-year cohort in 2-year intervals, we're able to construct estimates that apply to what we would observe for the 51 to 64-year-old population in 2010, that I'll present about today. One slide, and I don't need to tell this audience, is that work-limiting conditions increase in prevalence as people age. And I should mention, these are self-reports. People respond to the question, do you have a condition that limits your ability to work? But between 51 and 52, and about 10 years later, we see that this goes up by about 10 percentage points. At age 51 to 52, 17% of people report having such a condition. At 63 and 64 years old, 27% do. It's a pretty significant increase in a relatively short amount of time, a time when these people are approaching retirement age. Parentheses here, the percent of these people who don't have DI or SSI. And this is the fact that not everyone who reports this type of condition either applies or is eligible for DI or SSI, but also because what we present is we purely focus on the population who isn't already receiving such benefits. If a program like the one I talk about did get introduced, it's possible that some of the people who are claiming disability benefits would instead decide to participate in this program. But for what we present, we focus on this group, 12.5% at age 51 and 52, and 18.5% 10 years later, who don't have DI or SSI. So, as I just mentioned, not everyone who reports a work-limiting condition would be eligible for disability benefits, and similarly, not everyone who has such a problem would necessarily experience economic hardship as a result. So these are self-reports. We really don't know about the severity of one's condition. And our goal was to identify a group of people who not only report having a medical condition, but also experience hardship as a result. And we find this using two criteria. First is people have to experience an earnings loss around the time of onset. So from 2 years before they first report having a health condition to 2 years later, they have declines in earnings of 50%. And like I mentioned, we had to make an assumption about what this cutoff should be. We considered others, but really what we focus on here is the group that experiences an earnings loss of at least 50%. The other criteria that's also important is that not only do they have to have an earnings decline, they also have to fall into what we define as hardship, which is in household income that's less than 200% of poverty. And it was an assumption. We tried other thresholds, but really what we're interested in here is people who have an earnings decline and also result in having economic hardship. Now, the question, though, is in the actual program, you don't want to wait until people have suffered hardship to decide that they're eligible. So you don't want to wait until 2 years after onset, say, all right, your earnings have now declined by 50%, your income is now below poverty, great, you can participate in this program. The design here is to try to stimulate people to stay in the labor force. And so what we instead was model eligibility for a program based on the likelihood that people would fall into hardship. And so we figure out in our sample what characteristics were correlated with fall economic hardship after experiencing onset. And this has a secondary benefit as well, is that if a program were put in place where what determined whether you could participate was having an earnings decline, people could be inclined to game the system. So earnings had to fall by 50% and you thought your earnings were going to fall by 45%, you could reduce your work effort by just a little bit more to claim eligibility for the program. So it only allows us to not have people suffer first, it doesn't allow people to game the system in the same way, and also by using individual characteristics, it could allow much quicker determination to participate in a program than the lengthy process that Tim described for DI. And so for this is we used a metric model that used age, education, the occupation that one worked their longest job, marital status, to determine the likelihood that a person who has a medical condition that limits their ability to work would fall in hardship as a result. I should mention, in the real world, a may use different factors than the ones we're able to measure in the survey, and inevitably, such a model would misclassify some people. By using factors to predict hardship, we may unnecessarily include people in the program who wouldn't have made it if we had actually been able to measure their hardship and vice versa. But really the idea here is that by using very few factors, we can come to a model that would allow people quick determination into a program to support work. So considering this threshold of whether or not people would get into a program, we considered a few other restrictions that would really modify who would be eligible for such a program. So in the first here, what I show is just how many people report a work limitation and SEI or SSI in 2010 among 51 to 64-year-olds, and about 8.3 million. The next shows what if we use that threshold that I just talked about from our model, where we have anyone who has a probability of greater than 0.3 of experiencing hardship gets into our program. And again, another assumption that's built into this is 0.3, why not 0.2, 0.4? To make some assumptions, and the paper will have more details. What we see in this threshold is that if we age of eligibility still from 51 to 64, and we don't target the program, so at any point that a person has a work limitation, they can participate. We see that the population that's eligible for such a program would fall from 8.3 to 3.7 million. What if the program started at age 55 instead? And we see that the program drops down to 2 million. We considered a program that didn't start until age 60, and we see that that falls to 1.6 million. So depending on which age eligibility criteria you use, you can really vary the size of the population who would be eligible. And in what I'm going to show later, we considered variants of these in a bunch of different directions. Finally, this fourth row shows what happens if we started the program at age 55, but instead of allowing people to participate at every point, they were allowed to participate for the first 2 years after they reported onset. So if they reported onset at 55, they'd be eligible for the program at 55 and 57, and then they'd be able to participate anymore. We see that that drops the population from 2 down to 1.9. a little bit, I want to talk about the three policies that we specified that would be part of a work support type program. The first is a health insurance subsidy that we've designed after provisions in the Affordable Care Act. And in the act, it says that for people whose household incomes are below 400% of the federal poverty line, the amount that they'd be required to pay in premiums if they purchased it in the exchange or in the non-group market would be to their income relative to poverty. We use this amount to calculate for each person where their income is relative to poverty, what the amount they would be required to pay under the ACA is. Then we compare that to the premium for non-employer-based coverage for people who are 55 to 64. There was a report from the Kaiser Family Foundation in 2010 that said that for people who are in this age group, not necessarily those who have a work limitation, but who are in this age group, the premium for such policy would be $4,800. And so we compared the amount people would be required to pay under the ACA to the premium they would have to pay to get coverage and calculated for each person the subsidy amount they would receive. And I should mention some of the options to consider in terms of cost. We assume the cost for this subsidy would be borne by the program that we present. In reality, if the ACA provisions go into place, it may be paid out of general revenues. So it's really determining who pays for this. We mention it in a later slide, but it's not really something we delve into. These would be employment services allowance. And the idea of this would be to pay for services to help people in the labor force, or if they have already left, return to the labor force. And we model this after outcome payments in the Ticket to Work program, which, as most of you know, are paid to employment networks to assist DI and SSI beneficiaries in their return to work efforts. And in 2010, employment networks could receive $711 per month to assist beneficiaries in their return to work efforts. Assume that this amount would be available as a subsidy to individuals who hadn't yet left the labor force to get services to help them stay employed. Our program is an EITC, and basically what we're doing is extending the existing EITC. We use the rate that currently applies to households that have 3 children. And the reason we chose this amount is under this scheme, households can receive up to $5,600 in a maximum credit, compared to the EITC that applies to households without children of only $457. The reason we chose this maximum credit amount is in our earlier work where we compared how much people's incomes decline after onset relative to people who didn't experience onset. The average amount of the decline was about $13,500. So by giving people up to $5,600, we're able to offset a lot of the earnings decline that would result from having the onset of a new condition. So really the ultimate goal of our analysis is to see how our proposed policies would vary depending on which eligible population we use and what we estimate about how much of the programs would apply. So on the right here, or on the left column, what I show is what I call a lower cost option. And under the case, we assume introducing the EITC doesn't induce any change in earnings. So what people are earning under current policy, they would continue to do even if the EITC were available to them. We as health insurance costs are paid out of general revenues or aren't given to workers, and so there really isn't a health insurance component of this. We assume that employment services, rather than giving the full $711 a month, we chose a value of 25%. This type of program would cost between $6.3 and $16.3 million a year, which may sound high, although if you look at the average cost per person, it's about $3,200 a year to provide this type of employment support. And what we find in this scheme is that poverty rate among people with work limitations would be 32%. Again, it may sound high, but under current policy, the poverty rate among this group is 45%. So with a relatively minimal cost per year per person, we can reduce poverty from about 45% to 32%. The higher cost scheme, we assumed that the EITC does induce people to change their earnings. And in particular, look at is where people who are currently earning nothing, that the EITC would incentivize them to work at a level that's 50% of the difference in the earnings that they lost from working. And I mentioned that in our earlier analysis, we found that earnings declined by about $13,500 after onset. So this would say that people who were currently earning zero would earn about $6,000 a year with the EITC. We also assume in this scenario that the health insurance cost is borne by the program and that people are eligible for the full employment services subsidy of $500 a year. And we said the total cost of this program is substantially higher. It ranges from $28 to $78 billion a year. And I should mention in both cases, we've assumed 100% take-up of this program at this point, which means that we're very conservative in what we're assuming. So these costs are much higher than they likely would be. But what we see is average cost, even in this highest cost program, is about $14,600 a year, which current DI benefits are about $13,500. And many of those people receive Medicare, which on average for people on DI is about $11,000 a year. So a cost of $1,000 a year compared to costs that range between $13,000 and $5,000 a year for DI beneficiaries, this does seem so substantial. And if you look at the poverty rate, if under this highest cost scenario, you see that it drops down to 8%. And 8% poverty rate is very comparable to the rate of poverty that would be found in a group that didn't have onset at all. So for a relatively modest cost compared to these people going on DI, we can reduce poverty to a level that's almost as if they didn't have onset, and this would encourage work. Just to summarize, we've shown that current programs really don't offset losses that result from work-limiting medical conditions, and under current policies that would be designed to increase Social Security's earliest eligibility age, it could be made worse. As Tim showed, there are a lot of people who would really want to, would either be DI or would suffer hardship as a result of the increase. One here is in an exploratory analysis, it is possible to design a program that really is designed to support work. And it all protects against hardship. And in particular, what we find is that the cost per person would be less than if DI were expanded to meet the needs of this population, and would reduce poverty rates among those with a work-limiting medical condition to a level that would be similar to the group that didn't have a condition at all. So I will stop there and turn over to Virginia.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for the nice introduction. It's clear I am delighted to be talking about policy implications today. Clearly, these papers are very timely. As we speak, members of the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform are trying to agree on a report that includes a plan to increase the earliest eligibility age for Social Security benefits, exactly what both of these papers are about. Just a quick recap. Tim Wademan's paper looks at the health status of retirees and finds, very importantly, that improvements in health and life expectancy are not evenly distributed. In fact, those in poor health claim retirement benefits earlier than those in good health, and that the early retirement age could, in fact, impose real hardship on people who have difficulty working if they don't qualify for disability benefits. These also recall to me a study that by 3 SSA researchers, Leonizio, Vaughn, and Wixon, who looked at their report, or a brief based on their report, is now on NACI's website, and we have copies of them outside. Essentially, they looked at the question of how many early retirees have serious health problems, how many of them might qualify for disability insurance or SSI, and how many would fail to qualify. They shipped data from the 1990s that was linked to administrative records and found that about 25% of people claiming benefits at 62 to 4 had what could be characterized as significant health problems. At 25%, 8%, according to their simulations with administrative records, would qualify for disability benefits. The remaining 17% would not. Most of them because they were found to be eligible under the strict test of disability that applies to both of these programs. About 4% of cases might be sufficiently disabled but lacked insured status for disability insurance, or they did not meet the SSI means test. So there is potential for gap here if the early age is raised. The work by Jody Schimmel takes a further look at these interventions to try to use a work-based approach to intervene rather than extend disability insurance. And I guess very provocative and I think and promising approaches. In the discussion, I would like to focus and have both our experts respond and the people in our current audience and our virtual audience respond on two important policy questions that I think this issue raises and these papers raise. First, what kind of administrative arrangements needed to implement the very targeted approaches that Dee and Dave Stapleton in their paper envision? I think this is very promising, but making it work on the ground level is critically important, and I hope that's the next step. They've thought a lot about that, and I think there's a lot of work yet to think about on those areas. And the second question is even broader, and this is furthering the retirement age really a good policy? And I will suggest some thoughts about that as well. On the administrative justice side of implementing a new intervention that tries to match services with people who need those particular services, I'm struck with the challenge of administering the Social Security Disability Insurance Program, and we all know that is not simple. And so the challenge of allocating vocational rehabilitation services to the people who need them in a way that accurately and effectively matches need with the service. And clearly trying to figure out who should be eligible, say, for a wage subsidy is important. I mean, a wage subsidy is a good thing if you have a wage, but if you don't have a wage, it's zero. So how to find who the right people to get a subsidy and to make sure that it works. Or then for employment services, again, it's helpful to have that stipend and to get some services. If you end up with a job, don't end up with a job, you're still left of money to pay the rent. And would be interested in knowing more about how does the Ticket to Work serve as a model here? What we learned from the Ticket to Work that might be helpful here. Understanding of that approach is that much of the payment for those services comes after there is some proven evidence of success in helping a person find a job, and is that envisioned in this kind of plan? A final thought on investing in services to help people with significant work impediments remain in the workforce poses, if we're really going to try to figure out a better way to help people with significant work impediments remain in the workforce, is people at the ends of their work lives the best place to start? I don't know the answer to that, but clearly there's a great deal of unmet need with younger people, as well as people in mid-career, as well as early retirees. The second question, and that's even broader, is raising the retirement age good policy? Is it necessary? And here to just speak briefly about the case for raising the early age, or either the full benefit age or the early retirement age. The reasons we most often hear are, first, people are longer, so they should work longer. Second, people need incentives to work longer. And if people work longer, it will be good for the economy, and the economy will grow and all afford lots more stuff. The third reason is that Social Security costs too much. We have to lower the cost of Social Security. And I would to address each of these questions head on and suggest there might be other avenues to explore. Live longer. As Tim and his colleague pointed out, these improvements in health and life expectancy are clearly evenly distributed. In people with more education, high incomes, and better health and longer lifespans. Other research suggests they're also more likely to have jobs that can accommodate the kinds of impairments that come with aging. I think Krugman, in a recent op-ed, summarized it with a quip. If CEOs and professors are living longer, do janitors have to work longer? That's the real dilemma that we face in trying to use changing the age to address this very diverse population. On incentives to work longer, I'd like back and take a fresh look at retirement age policy within the Social Security system. We already have a very flexible retirement age policy. You can claim retirement benefits at any age between 62 and 70. Moreover, every year they wait, their benefit will be higher. So the financial reward for waiting is substantial. And in fact, financial reward for waiting beyond full benefit age is now much greater than it has been throughout most of the history of the Social Security program. One of the things we did in 1983 was increase the so-called delayed retirement credit. Now, for every year you work after the full benefit age, now 66, you get an 8% increase in your benefit. Not 3% like it used to be, but 8%. So if the difference between claiming benefits at 70 versus claiming benefits at 62 is roughly 76% increase in the lifetime income for that particular individual. This is powerful, and I have a sense that it's not well understood because people haven't been talking about it. It was enacted in 1983. It kind of phased into the law, but we're really talking about this. NASSI brief explains these in much greater detail, when to take Social Security issues to consider. But it is possible, given this range of ages, that we might have it right. That in fact, people who work longer, who have the capacity to work longer, who have longer life expectancies, better health, jobs that accommodate impairment come with aging, if they the financial reward, they might be more likely to work longer. Moreover, the people who need early retirement benefits often have their life expectancy, few employment options, limited demand for their services. The early age at 62 may also be the best solution for that group. The first step we need before further raising retirement ages would be to beef up efforts by the Social Security Administration, employers, unions, advisors, and the media to help people understand the implications of Social Security at 62 or waiting to the full benefit age or even further until age 70. Finally, the last point, do we need to make Social Security cost less? The last plug I'll make for another NASSI brief is one that just came out on strengthening Social Security for the long term. In this brief, we challenge the conventional wisdom that Social Security costs too much or we need to make it cost less. This brief marshals evidence from a variety of sources on why one could make a good case here. First, the 1983 reforms already cut benefits significantly, and benefit cuts are still phasing in, notably increase in the full benefit age, the per delay in cost of living increases that occurred back then, affected long-term cost of the program forever, and the fact that Social Security benefits are subject to income taxes. With those changes, Social Security is clearly affordable if you use the standard way of assessing what's affordable for our economy. We look at total cost as a share of the entire economy or GDP. Social Security is just under 5% today. It's scheduled to go up to about 6% when all the baby boomers are retired, and then it's scheduled to stay at 6% for the rest of the next 75 years. That's different from the forecast for health care. I mean, health care is expected to go up and up and up, but Social Security is not, and it has its own source of funding that is adequately financing the program now and for the next 25 or so years. And the shortfall after that is relatively modest. Finally, the 1983 reforms asked relatively little from contributors over the long term. The 7-year balance back there came from 50% reductions in future benefits for beneficiaries. 2% came from extending coverage made to federal employees. Just 10% was new contributions from workers and employers. Yet, opinion polls, Americans consistently say they would rather pay more than see Social Security benefits cut further. Party lines. Democrats, Republicans, and independents say they don't mind paying for Social Security because they see its value. They expect it for themselves, though they lack confidence in it. They value it for what it does for their aging relatives, and they value it for what it does to millions of other people that they know depend on it. So to wrap up, I think the questions that I hope to stimulate discussion on today are really how might we implement some of these very intriguing and challenging service to help older people remain at work. That's important whether or not you raise the early eligibility age. But second, given growing evidence that life expectancy, health, and opportunities to work longer are not evenly distributed, may have the right retirement age policy already, with a range of ages between 62 and 70 that handsomely reward those who can to work longer and stay in jobs until 70. Thanks.
Ended on time, I guess. Good. So I guess I'll have the three speakers stand up here with me, and we will start to take questions from the audience. Allison has a handheld mic, so if you will raise your hand, she'll bring the mic around to you, and when you you can in front of me if you want. Well, whatever. Yeah. How am I going to use the mic? Raise your hand, and she'll bring the mic around, and then introduce yourself and tell us who you are.
Thank you. I'm Ruffing from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. It is reported that tomorrow the Hamilton Project of the Brookings Institution is going to come out with a proposal that would essentially require employers to purchase temporary disability insurance for their employees. And the program would last for 2 years and serve as a required gateway into the Social Security disability program. And I wonder if the presenters today had any comments on that proposal.
You have the mic here.
I actually heard about this proposal yesterday. I wrote the author and asked for an advance copy, and they said it's embargoed until tomorrow. But it was reported in the Washington Post, so I know as much as the Washington Post told us about it. I'm very interested in finding out more about this. It seems to me that I'm trying the rationale for requiring employers to provide temporary disability insurance. A mandate on employers seems ill-timed right now, quite frankly. And based on experience with private disability insurance, which we have looked at in the past, part of the reason why private disability insurance, employment-based disability insurance, is so much more effective that it covers only about 30% of the population, and it's the white-collar workers who have a strong connection to their employer and an employer who wants to keep their employers, and so it gives them those kinds of benefits. Extrapolate that experience would apply to 100% of the workers under Social Security is a different matter. But I hope to see the paper.
I didn't see the paper either, and I've also asked for it. But there are intriguing things about it. I thought for a long time that, and I'm not the only one by any means, that there's going to be an effective change disability policy to reduce the number of people that go on in the disability rolls. It has to happen early. We have to have early intervention when people are still connected to their employers. And so I think, that's a piece of the idea behind that, which makes sense to me, without knowing how they're actually trying to implement it. I think a piece of it is creating incentives for employers to employ people after they've experienced the onset of some medical condition. And I would hope that whatever they're doing is to do that. But it seems to me that this is going to be a proposal worth paying attention to, at least for those two reasons.
Hi, I'm Shafford from the American Association of People with Disabilities. And on the subject of new studies, Workforce Flexibility 2010 at Georgetown Law School and the University of California at Berkeley today presented a paper advocating for the creation of a social insurance program that would provide wage replacement for short-term disability, for caregiving, and for new parents. And so I commend that to all of you to look at as well as another way to keep people in the workforce and potentially reduce people on the Social Security disability rolls, but not aimed at this population. But having heard that this morning and then this new, I'm really struck by the social contract issues that you talked about, Virginia. I'm going to ask the extent to which you looked in. I think maybe I'm very intrigued by your idea that maybe we have the right balance, and I include in that given the social contract we've made with people who have been paying into the social security system for decades. But I was struck as we went through the first set of slides, Tim, the difference of women who are working with substantial limitations and men. And did you look at all, or are you interested in looking at how the pay gap is affecting people's behavior in deciding when they decide to take retirement, both with wages that they've had women have had potentially throughout their careers, as well as the difficulty in therefore accumulating wealth?
That's certainly in question. I think that the scope of what we're doing here doesn't include that, except to the extent that we incorporate more explicit data about coverage for DI benefits. Those kind of issues will come forward more. Right now, we don't control one's own ability to start to even receive any DI benefits, but I think once can do that, I think that these kind of issues will become more stark.
I'm Cash Dollar from America's Health Insurance Plans. Question primarily for Virginia, but for the other speakers if they care to take a crack at it. To address your concerns regarding the people who are ill health when they approach the early retirement age, are there the disability program that would allay your concerns, or that you would think necessary if somehow retirement age is raised?
I had a lot of thought. I think it's a very good question. It gives me pause is the difficulty and the backlogs in implementing the disability insurance program, and to add more people to that strikes me as problematic. I mean, if we had a smooth functioning disability insurance program, then I think that kind of approach would be much more appealing. But if we're just adding more people to queues, that would be a problem.
UCSF. So I was, Dave and Dr. Mal, I was really impressed by your policy options there. One thing that didn't make it on your slide was employers gaming the system. We know that with respect to earned income tax credits in general, that they're a subsidy in large measure both to the recipient, but also to either existing or potential employers. And how would you prevent gaming on the part of employers who have workers they may lay off and or whose productivity or whose productivity they note or something like that, so that they're too not gaming in the system?
Sure. Yeah. I guess it depends on what you call gaming the system. I mean, to my mind, the idea is to provide a subsidy that encourages the worker to continue working, and you know, we weren't imposing a requirement that they stop working before they get the subsidy, right? So it's not like the employer would have to lay somebody off, and it's not like they'd have to demonstrate a loss in earnings. It would be the case that they would have to, you know, have a medical condition that was verifiable, but also, you know, be in a category that made them at high risk for disability. And I do think that it's pretty likely that some of the benefits of that would accrue to employers, and that the cost of them employing that individual would go down. So that some of it would shift on the employer.
Hi, I'm Pinkness from OMB, and I think Virginia alluded to this, but have you thought about, in terms of the EITC idea, how the IRS implements or administers EITC now? And as much as we have a problem with DI and backlogs, do we really want the IRS judging whether someone has a disability or work limitation? I mean, or else you're left with self-attestation, which we already got, some problems with the EITC in terms of error rate. So have you thought about that piece of it at all?
Well, we thought it some. I mean, there's lots that needs to be done in that area, and Virginia raised this important question about administration. I guess we don't see setting up a whole process like Social Security has now, because we think that the criteria would not be, for medical eligibility, wouldn't be as strict, but there would have to be some evidence shown. I don't see the IRS getting in the business of actually doing that, but somebody would have to do it, obviously, and I'm not sure who that would be.
I'm Burson with SSA. I think in the 90s, when NACI's disability policy panel was working, there was a proposal for a disability tax credit, and I think in that case, if I recall correctly, they used the criteria was that someone had to demonstrate that they had a severe disability, basically using what SSA folks would recognize as being the step 2 criteria in the determination process. It's a process that's not as cumbersome as going through the entire process that SSA uses, but there is the process there that already designed. The other thing I wanted to mention in terms of changing the programs to deal with some of the early retiree folks is I wanted to remind you that Virginia talked about the 4 or 5% who appear to be medically qualified at age 62 to DI or SSI, but they don't meet the insured status requirements or the means test for SSI, and perhaps that's a situation, a problem with the safety gap that could be rethought.
Let me say more about the administration. We're of course aware of the EITC proposal from the Commission back in 1995, I guess it was, and in fact, some of the motivation for the work that I have been doing was the thought that, well, if policy reformers are going to push forward with increasing the retirement ages or reducing the value of benefits for early retirees, maybe this is a place where we could bring in an EITC or something else, at top end. I mean, it's just the way SSDI came in the first place, right? It was for workers over the age of 50, and it's gradually the age has been reduced. So maybe this is an opportunity to try something which other people have recommended we do for workers of any age. So I think that's one perspective on this. It's certainly our perspective. But as far as medical eligibility is concerned, I don't think we want to require the individuals to meet or equal the listings, the step 2 that you were talking about. That's step 2 is, do you have a severe impairment? Okay. Well, then that would be, that might be okay then. The other thing about determinations that's different now than it was in 1995 is that we are, reaching the threshold of having electronic medical records for a very large share of the population, and certainly most workers. And USA is already starting to take in medical evidence through electronic records, and it incredibly speeds up the process for the small share of people that do have it. So I would say that when those are in place, and the Obama administration is pushing for 4 years from now, we would have a tool that we didn't have before that could really help in this determination process. So, I thought about the other point you were making about the people who aren't disability insured. Anybody else want to comment on that? Okay. Sure. Yeah.
One, of what you mentioned about the disabled worker tax credit that our panel recommended, I think they really didn't come to a clear. One of the truly left unanswered questions was exactly how you would adjudicate it. I think that step 2 criteria, right now, it's used to reject trivial cases in the DI adjudication process. It's not used to give people any money. And if it were used to give people any money, then I think you might want something substance than that.
Looks just one question from the folks tuning online. Ricardo Chavez asks, how was it determined that those in the early retirement groups were not eligible for disability benefits? Is the data based on hard evidence of injuries to sustain work-related activities? The question, I think, came during Jody's presentation.
Okay. For the way we created these definitions, we used, I guess, hard as evidence as we have available for a population that's not in Medicare, that where for the H would actually have diagnostic information from medical records for those folks. But for everyone else, the medical information comes from questions for conditions anyway. Has a doctor ever told you have X, Y, or Z? And that question worded as a way of weeding out people who just know in their hearts that they have something, but tries to restrict to people whose doctors actually told them that. But on the other measures of that go into the eligibility index, based on fairly specific questions divorced from social context, which might pollute the answers. But so they're asked whether the difficulty, walking up one flight of stairs, walking up multiple flights of stairs, walk several blocks. So these are sort of designed so that people don't think about the connection with their ability to work, but do end up being very highly related to work capacity and to actual DI eligibility. And so those are the types of measures we use. And so I would classify them as hard evidence as you can get from a self-reported survey.
Further observation on that, in the study I was citing that Bernie Wixson was one of the authors of, I think that used data that the Social Security Administration has that actually has some administrative record data where there were efforts to, through information available from SIP, up with a record for trying to simulate disability eligibility. And I exhausted my knowledge of that.
and I guess that I think our numbers and being fairly comparable in scale gives me.
Elaine, Social Security. For Jody and Dave. Yeah, it's closer. Okay. For Jody and Dave, and this gets back to the operational aspects of their proposal. Have you done any work on the misclassification rate?
We actually, part of what we didn't show today is looking at the likelihood of being a false positive or false negative using these various thresholds that we looked at. And what we were looking at there is really what fraction of people are, what fraction are we letting into the program that wouldn't be, and vice versa. And I don't know if are there details. We found sort of what you would expect, that the people who are getting into the program look the worst off. The people who are into the program look the best off in terms of income and the likelihood of falling into poverty. And then the middle groups are sort of where you think they'd be in terms of misclassification. That they look, the people who aren't getting into the program but should be, look most to the people. I'm going to confuse myself on the whole false. So in any case, it's where you would expect it to fall, and we have looked at it, and we purposely, the reason we chose the threshold that I showed, just 0.3, is because it's a threshold where we think we have a reasonable number of false positive and false negatives. There's trade-offs, so you can't get quite right, but we picked a threshold where we thought it made sense.
What are the sizes of the misclassification?
I don't think we can recite the numbers, but also the case that what we're using is just the data that happened to be in a survey, right? So our purpose here was just to illustrate the approach and also to illustrate that there would be false positives and false negatives. I think they're substantial numbers, and I think way of saying that what Jody was describing was that the people who are false positives, they look a lot worse off than the people who don't get the benefits, right? So, and the same is true for the false negatives. They should have got the benefits, but they didn't, or they're not nearly as bad off as the average people that actually get the benefits. We get a real-world program. The trade-off between false positive and false negatives would be better because you'd have better information. It is something that's an important piece of the policy. Is that it, the questions?
Wood from NIDER, National Institute on Disability and Research. Elaborate a little more on the disability index. You kind of minute and didn't talk about it. What comprises that? How did you develop it, and so on?
Well, it's a propensity for that we made it a logit model with people actually on DI and people who aren't, and threw in a whole bunch of conditions, functional limitation, individual functional limitation variables, and predicted for the pooled sample of DI and non-DI folks the statistics that were most associated with being a DI beneficiary, and then then we calculated predicted predictability of being on DI based on your observable characteristics. And so people with people most like the DI population got high scores. People look least like the DI population got low scores.
Your next question, I thought maybe I would respond to one of Virginia's questions, or a couple of them, I guess. She wanted to know what would happen to people in the program that Jody talked about if they weren't able to get a job. And Jody said this, but to reemphasize it, this DI program would still be there, right? So if somebody really couldn't work because of a health condition, presumably they could apply for that program. So and in fact, I think there's a good case to be made that for people over an age, maybe over 62, especially if you raise the early eligibility age, you might want to do something to get it a little bit easier to get into that program. For exactly that case. She asked about these allowances, which Jody mentioned were modeled after Ticket to Work. They're modeled after Ticket to Work in the sense that the level of the allowances was, but I think the idea here really is to provide people with a lower level of income support that they would get under the SSDI program, but something that would help them defray the extra medical costs that they might have that might not be covered by insurance, extra costs that they might have for getting back and forth to work or for accommodations and that sort of thing. And so it wouldn't actually be conditioned on whether they're actually working or not. However, it would be conditioned on whether they're applying for Social Security benefits. So, another way to think of it is, well, we're paying them to stay off of SSDI, and if that might be less expensive than having them apply. Questions? Well, I guess we got done a little early today. Anything else on the and the date for our next forum? I meant to get the flyer. Okay. Well, we'll send you all an announcement when we have it for our next forum. It'll be sometime in March. I hope to see many back here. Thank you very much for coming today, and thank our speakers.